Welcome everyone. Welcome to BAME Online. I'm super excited to be hosting the session on fundraising's place in the anti-racism movement. I'm joined here by some amazing speakers who all have a whole wealth of knowledge on the topic. I'm joined by Fozia Irfan, Vule, and Rickesh Lakhani. Would you all like to introduce yourselves? Let's go to Fozia. Have we lost Fozia?
Hello, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Cool. I'll say that line again, and then hopefully we can get it in the edit. We'll go to Fozia first.
Hi everyone. Oops. Hi everyone, I'm Fozia and I'm really excited to be here. I work at BBC Children in Need as their Director of Children and Young People. And I'm also the founder of the DEI Coalition of Funders here in the UK, which is a group of funders who are coming together to look at structural inequality through a DEI lens. I also do some lecturing at Cass Business School, and probably the thing that most people don't know about me is that I am a mum of 4 boys. And whenever I say that, I do expect a round of applause just for that. Thank you.
I mean, that's the biggest job for sure. Vule, let's hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Vule. I have been a nonprofit leader for over a decade, and I just recently left my position to just be a troublemaker full time. I write the blog Nonprofit AF, and I got 2 boys, and I can't imagine having 4. I just can't.
So lovely to have you here. I can't even think how often I've read your blog. I love your blog. Rickesh, welcome.
Thank you. I'm Rickesh Lakhani. I'm the Executive Director at Future Possibilities for Kids, a small and mighty organization in the Greater Toronto area. We're working with children to give them a space to explore their activist inside and achieve community service projects while building their confidence and leadership. Been in this social good sector for about 15 years. And this is so interesting. I'm completing the cycle. I have 3 boys at home.
Oh, wow.
So we've got 2, 3, and 4 between us. We've got a team here. So that's pretty amazing. And just really excited to be here. Definitely not an anti-racism expert, but a work in progress. Just excited to learn and share.
I feel like if I said here that I had 1 boy, that it would complete the circle, but I can't, unfortunately. Yeah, thank you so much for that. It was really lovely hearing from you all. I'm Jon Cornejo. I'm a campaigner, an activist, and an organizer with Charity So White. I'm also an anti-racism consultant at the moment, which is a new sort of thing for me and super interesting to be here. Now, Charity So White have been working within the UK sort of charity sector, where sort of people of colour led collective campaigning for change within the sector. And pretty much since day one, we have been looking at fundraising and philanthropy as one of the sort of areas of like target areas for us in terms of pushing and thinking around how we can build anti-racism into that. This is obviously a massive, massive topic, and especially it's a problem around the world, which is why we've got speakers from all over the globe here today. And I guess what I want from this session is just to sort of try and delve really deeply into the roots of philanthropy, how they link to colonialism, the systems at play, the sort of really deep power structures at play within the fundraising and philanthropy world, and just ask the question, like, can we even have an anti-racist approach to philanthropy, and what would that look like? I want to kick off just by getting each of you to sort of talk about one topic in particular and start building that picture. I want to kick off with Fozia, and I just want to sort of start on sort of the root and the history of philanthropy and sort of its roots to violent colonial expansion and oppression. And just from that perspective, can we ever really take an anti-racist approach to philanthropy?
That's a really big question, but it's a really important question that we haven't seriously tackled here in the UK. You know, and I've been doing some research in relation to philanthropy and colonialism. And it's there's a saying by Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I've really been considering that question in terms of philanthropy, because it is predicated on a social and economic system in which it thrives, but which it also exploits. So with that foundation, can it ever really be said to genuinely be in favour of dismantling a system which it's born from? And I think particularly in the UK, when institutionalised philanthropy foundations developed, was sort of in the late 18th century, 19th century. And that particular time, you had a very Victorian paternalistic model of philanthropy. At the same time, there was a historical context which was all about empire building, all about colonialism, slavery, etc., etc. So philanthropy itself really came out of those foundations, institutional philanthropy I'm talking about. And what I think is interesting is to think about how those origins are still impacting philanthropy today in terms of the structures, in terms of the culture, etc. But the second thing that I'm really interested in is looking at how philanthropy, and particularly colonial philanthropy, which was a type of philanthropy where missionaries to a large extent went across the world and tried to civilize other nations, and how that colonialism led to a historical situation where those countries were colonized, but then more recently in the 1960s, those same colonized countries, residents were invited from those countries to come over to the UK and live and work here. And that same situation has predicated the racial disparities that we see today. So there's a clear link between colonialism, people coming over from the Commonwealth into the UK, and the racial disparities that we see today. So when I see philanthropy and foundations talking about racial disparities, but not acknowledging that historical context, I think it's a very superficial conversation.
No, thank you. And yeah, there's lots to dive into on that. But I want to bring in Vu just to start helping us dream up an anti-racist approach, an anti-racist future for fundraising and philanthropy. And I want to ask just what frameworks do we need to disrupt? What frameworks do we need to change to get to more of a sort of anti-racist place within fundraising?
Thank you, John. I think we need to get out of this sort of white moderate way of doing things, right? Which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. warned us about. Is the biggest barrier to justice is not the people burning crosses and marching, right? Wearing hoods that we have over here in the United States, right? It's the people who are really well-meaning, who say, I really agree with you in your goals of creating a better, more just world, but I just wish that you would be more nice. You'd be nicer and more civil and more respectful about that. And I really feel that fundraising has been one giant white moderate sort of field in a white moderate sector in a white moderate world, right? Our fundraising has been focused on the comfort of rich, mostly white people, and making them feel really good about themselves. And so they can avoid thinking about what Fozia was saying about slavery and colonization. How do we address injustice if we're not willing to see that, right? So in order for us to do that, then we need to get out of that. We have to get them out of this mindset. We have to kind of deprogram so many of the philosophies that we trained in fundraisers. We trained them to make sure that you are subservient to the donors, and your job is to make them feel good about themselves, to write them handwritten thank you notes, to connect them to stuff that they care about. And I'm saying that is not working anymore. You feel that it's working, but what you're doing is entrenching the sort of donor dominance and the ego of donors in fundraising, right? And so we're going to get out of that. Then we have to start thinking differently, including having some very difficult conversations with donors and challenging them on racism, getting them to examine where their wealth came from, whether it's from slavery or stolen indigenous land or whatever, getting them out of this mindset that what they care about is what's important. honestly, I think we need to care less about what donors care about, and care more about what will actually create change and bring about justice. But instead, we tell donors, whatever you care about, we're going to be like your personal shopper of equity. We're going to help you find the mission that aligns with you. And this is why we have so many missions that are being underfunded, because the donors don't care about that. And we tell them that it's okay that they don't care about these things, because whatever they care about is the awesome thing. The other thing that we have to acknowledge is that we are complicit, and our jobs rely on the existence of inequity, because our job is to fight inequity. If there's nothing to fight, then we won't have a job, right? So in many ways, we are unconsciously fighting against this sort of world that we're saying that we're trying to build. And so if we don't acknowledge that, then I don't know how we're going to be able to go and talk and have these honest conversations with donors, right? How do we rock a boat if we might actually fall out of the boat? We might lose our job. Because if we don't do that, then I don't know how we're gonna move forward.
There is so much there that we can unpick, and I'm loving this, because I feel like we're cutting really deep, but I want to cut even deeper. I want to bring in Rickesh just to talk to us about the power structures in play in the fundraising world, and just what it takes to disrupt them and dismantle them.
Yeah, thank you, John. Great hearing from everyone so far. I mean, for me, there's an external and internal component to the power structures. My real focus is looking at internally how we're treating, honestly, fundraising staff. I mean, there's if you've read Collecting Courage, which was a group of Black fundraisers speaking about their experiences in Canada and the U.S., it's absolutely horrible to know that that's happening in our space at the same time while we're talking about equity and all these other issues. So to me, it's like, how do we have board and leadership setting the tone about what is and what is not accepted within our own organizations? Having those policies in place that protect staff and community. For example, we've put into place, we've specifically named donors in our anti-oppression and anti-harassment policy. Because when you're sending in a fundraiser of color to speak with, as was said, primarily white donors, the power dynamics are just, off the chart. You have to, explicitly state that staff are not required to engage if they don't feel safe to do so, and they don't have to put up with crap. Right? This is what we do. We just feel like, I don't want to risk that donation. But if a staff member is there and they don't feel like they have leadership support, they're choosing between potentially their job and their well-being, and that's kind of a no-win situation. So, I mean, it doesn't mean everyone feels safe to speak out, but they need to know that if they bring something forward to leadership about their experience, that they're going to be supported. To me, that's such an important part of this, that for fundraisers themselves, imagine that they know that a donor doesn't have the power to influence their job status. That is allows them to really navigate this in a much better way. We're not seeing a lot of that right now. In fact, we're seeing the opposite, where things are being brought forward around racism and discrimination, and they're being swept under the rug, or people are getting very defensive. But it really does take us being willing to sever relationships and lose donations when there's instances of racism, harassment, or donors not behaving properly, and it's not resolved through conversation. I mean, I've had that happen, where we've lost donations, but that we have to be okay with that and know that we shouldn't subscribe to scarcity mindset, where we feel like we have to accept this gift and ignore all the rest of the stuff because we need this funding for our programs. Then on the external side, it is, as we've said here already, is like pushing donors to really think about these things. I think we're so afraid of offending donors and just we've been trained as fundraisers to just make them the boss. And I see that being honest with donors as a sign of respect, that, we've got access to so many different spaces and people of power and influence, or in different varieties. It's like, why wouldn't we want to help to shift their thinking and help to bring them along with the larger movement? And so I think challenging them that these things do exist as systemic issues, racism, and respecting them enough to believe that they can handle and manage that idea and hold that in their brain, and questioning, having them, I ask a question, for example, why do you think that this issue exists in the first place, the issues that we're trying to tackle, and getting them thinking about that. And if they pull their funding because I've asked that question or I've brought something forward, then I think that says a lot more about the relationship, and I'm going to look elsewhere. So it's giving money is not enough. They can also be part of being in their peer groups and promoting anti-racism in their peer groups and really being part of that in a larger way. I just don't really see why we would not want to do that, because to me, fundraising really is activism. So I think there's a risk of doing that for sure, but that's where this collective piece comes in. It's really easy to shut down one fundraiser or one charity or one leader making noise and pushing back. But when you have everyone joining together and they're like, okay, we really have to pay attention. I mean, I hope it would be done because it's the right thing to do, but we're often seeing that might not be the case. So we really do need to collectively push back as well.
I love that. I love the idea of fundraising and activism, and I think there's something there in terms of just a desire to be that and do that and fulfill that, but also just this fear of what that brings, and the fear of kind of pushback, or the fear of losing funders and donations, and the sort of dynamics at play. And you've kind of all spoken about this generally in terms of like the kind of structures in place in terms of fundraising and philanthropy as it happens now, and the kind of tensions that are at play in terms of just wanting to make money for the organization, for the charity, and sort of having kind of ways that this is just done and this happens. And I'm also quite interested because like you're all obviously from different countries. We've got the US, we've got Canada, we've got the UK, all of you from sort of different perspectives in terms of different sort of missions and things you're working towards. But then this underlying problem of sort of how do we build in anti-racism? How do we tackle systemic changes and sort of problems at a societal level while still making money and sort of still being afraid of losing it? I'd like to hear from each of you in terms of your context. Like, what is the situation like in each of your countries in terms of that dynamic, and how is it playing out within the fundraising world? I'm going to start with Fozia.
I think that dynamic that you alluded to, John, in terms of these are real issues, these are real structures that fundraisers face. And for me, being part of the philanthropic world, that is something that I think there's a responsibility on foundations really to tackle it from their side as well, because you will see on so many foundation websites and pages, people will, the foundations will say quite clearly, we're here to tackle racial injustice, we're here to tackle structural inequality. It's when things start to get uncomfortable for them, and when people start to question them or question the way that they give funds, that's when foundations find things difficult and tend to withdraw. So I would question whether that really is somebody's mission. If they're saying it, broadcasting it, but not actually backing that up with action. And I think one of the fundamental issues that we have, particularly with philanthropy, is that it is based upon this pornography of pain, which is a term that colonialists used to use 200 years ago, talking about this very same issues, that we require communities to show us trauma and pain in order to give them funding, rather than thinking about building assets, building power, building joy. And I think that is a real fundamental shift that philanthropy and foundations need to look at. I also think fundamentally foundations need to examine where their wealth is from, be really explicit about where that wealth has come from, and if it has been extracted from colonialism, from slavery, follow the example of the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, which a few weeks ago made an explicit statement, recognized it, and said that they were going to undergo a process of learning and reparations in relation to that. So those sorts of real fundamental questions, I think, need to be understood. And the last thing that I would say, which I think is really important for fundraisers to question foundations about, is whether or not foundations have an inbuilt colonial social architecture. Now, colonial social architecture is quite a big topic, but I'm just trying to find the name of the person who wrote about it. Tema Okun and Kenneth Love. So you can, they wrote a workbook on dismantling racism, and they talk specifically about a colonial architecture. And I really want us within foundations to start thinking about how we have recreated and embedded that colonial architecture within our processes, within our power dynamics, within our relationships with people who come to us for funding.
Thank you for that. Pornography of pain is such an apt term for the way that the sort of white savior narrative and white gaze operates in fundraising at the moment. And it's, yeah, that's a whole big conversation as well, but thank you for that. Vu, what's the situation like in the US, or your little corner of it?
We seem to be having an existential crisis over here in the United States regarding philanthropy and fundraising. I think it's a necessary one. And it's fun to see, but there's also a lot of resistance right now. I think that some foundations are a little bit more open to doing things differently. I see more foundations giving out funding directly to Black communities, for example, saying this is a Black fund and it's only accessible to Black community-led organizations, which is, I think, where philanthropy should be going, instead of what it's been doing, which is like to have this sort of like level playing field approach, where we just need to create this fair process, and whoever applies, and we just, we'll score them, etc. And no, like we can't do that. If foundations really care about communities, then they need to target the communities that are most affected by systemic injustice and ensuring that they get funding to do that. So I'm starting to see that. Among fundraisers, though, there's been so much fragility. I mean, I've been working on this community-centric fundraising movement, and it's talking about what we're doing right now, what we're talking about, right? And there's just so much. I do not encounter so much fragility as I do when talking to white fundraisers about how white fundraising has been lifting up sort of this white supremacy and white moderation in our sector. And to the point where I'm accused of vilifying people and I get hate mail. But I think this is good, right? This means that people are it's making a difference. It's seeping into the consciousness, and we just need to keep pushing.
Absolutely. And I really hear that around the existential crisis. And I think we can all relate to that in terms of what is happening in our offices, in our workplaces when it comes to these conversations. And yeah, that's Rickesh, what's the picture like in Canada at the moment?
Well, Canada often mirrors in some ways what's going on in the US. I think there's a lot of pieces that I echo what Vu had just said around fragility, around people doing a lot of exploration and internal reflection. But I also do see the pieces where people are, whether it's donors or corporations or institutions, just wanting to be seen to be supporting certain things that happen to be in the moment, and not necessarily the long-term commitment to investing beyond when the media, dies down. And I think we've seen a lot of that. Now, we have seen some organizations dramatically changing their approaches, but I do hope to see that they're looking ahead and saying, what are we going to do for years to come, rather than just this moment in time. There was a report released here called Unfunded, which spoke to the dramatically low level of funding that does go to Black-led or Black-serving communities. And that's something that we inherently knew was happening, but until you actually have the data, apparently, people aren't believing it. But that report triggered, some other conversations and the establishment and investment in some new funds. So I want to see more of that. My only thing is that right now it's still a drop in the bucket. And if you look at primarily where funding is going from, whether it's government or institutions or donors, we're still seeing all of these same things replicated. So I think that in Canada, we also have this thing where we believe that racism isn't a problem, even more so than what you might see in other countries, where we're also polite. Canada's got it all worked out. And I'm just like, wow, that actually makes it sometimes more painful, because there's this image of Canada being this perfect place where this doesn't exist. And that comes into the sector too. There's this superiority complex in Canada that is really a challenge to breaking through and getting through. But with the establishment of, as I said, some of these other foundations, with movements like Collecting Courage, and even a group called Agency that works on equity philanthropy here in Canada, released a report called The Duality of Giving. And they reflected what's happening, what philanthropy, informal and formal, looks like in the context of African communities. And so that's opening up sort of new conversations around who do we define as being a philanthropist? What do we define as fundraising? What do we define as support? And I really hope that those continue to shape things. So I'm like optimistic, but I still would want to see a lot more movement before I feel like we're really making true progress.
And that's something that is really sort of underpinning a lot of this. And like, I think discussions around anti-racism in the sector is this whole idea that like we're good people because we do good work and therefore we can't be racist. And that's a real undercurrent behind all of this. It really stops us from having the discussions that we want to have. Fozia, you had a question for our panel.
Yeah, I've just had a question for both Rickesh and Vu. In terms of the funding that's being allocated, Vu, you mentioned that greater funding is reaching communities of colour. This funding, is this funding just to treat the symptoms in terms of its project funding, short term, limited, or are we talking about funding which is really directly addressing systemic issues and going to the heart of the problem, advocacy, movement building, communications, all of those things? I'm interested to know what the experience is in Canada and the US, because I've found, even in the last year or so, there has been a lot of funding allocated to communities. It's been very piecemeal and it's still treating the symptoms.
Yeah, we still see some of that over here. I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic that a lot of the funding is it comes with autonomy for the organizations to be able to do whatever the heck they want to do, and I think that's something that we have to really push for too, because I think we can't address systemic racism if we have our hands tied behind our back and just saying, well, we're only going to fund you if you're going to run a homeless shelter, right? Which are important, right? But if that's what the communities care about, then that's what it is. Over the United States, we are terrified of advocacy. Foundations are terrified of it, and they will put language into grant contracts saying you cannot use any of this money for lobbying, for advocacy, and then we wonder why we've been behind on everything. And I really feel like if we're going to address systemic racism, it can't just be about these individual things that we can each do at an organization, which are important, but they're necessary, but they're not sufficient, right? You can diversify your board and staff and all of that. That's wonderful. But if our sector is going to address racism and systemic injustice, then we've got to start thinking about these levers of power, including getting more women of color elected into office, changing the tax codes, protecting voting rights. Right now, there are hundreds of bills in the United States suppressing Black and brown votes. We can talk all we want about racism in our boardroom, but if we as a sector and as fundraisers are not talking about how we can build collective community power to address these systems, why then we're just going to always be responding to the symptoms. I think we need to push funders to understand that, and it's been very challenging.
Rickesh.
I think I echo some of that too. I think it seems that many of them are still a long way from that. Like it's just, oh look, we're looking at a pie chart. Here's where our funding goes, and we're moving it from one slice to another. And rather than thinking about the actual way in which it's being implemented and invested, and you talked about autonomy, but it's like that if you're still making the decisions about where the money goes, and you're still going through your old process, which was broken and based on some of the broken values we've been talking about. And that's just going to continue to reinforce some of the same issues. So I don't actually see a lot of movement towards addressing the systemic pieces from like a funding standpoint. There is some, but I again, that's another piece that I would like to see more of. I mean, I think what's happening now is people are like, look, we're doing it. We're investing more in certain communities. It's like, yeah, but we're not going to really. How do we turn the tap off at the source in terms of where this is happening? And I don't see enough of that discussion happening. I think that they're unfortunately just not quite there yet. Like the last year, especially the year and a half, has been like a learning for some of those organizations, and you almost get a little impatient. But I don't think I've seen that, unfortunately, as much as we probably need.
I want us to use this moment as well just to try and invite our audience to really call them in to reflect on the practices that they take with their fundraising and the practices they see in the sector, and sort of try and start thinking about the things that the sector should be letting go of to move towards anti-racism, the really problematic stuff that we just need to stop. Because I remember my background is in campaigning, and I just remember so many times working and talking with fundraisers and who are looking for a very particular type of story to tell that will set off a very particular type of emotions of sort of white guilt and white saviorism amongst an audience in order to get them, to prompt them to take action and to donate funds. and just always feeling deeply uncomfortable about that, and sort of not quite being able to push back as much as I would have liked to at the sort of earlier on in my career. So I guess from each of you, like, what is your message to the sector? What are the things we just need to stop doing right now? Fozia, I'm going to start with you.
I think for my sector, for the philanthropic sector, it's really to fundamentally be self-aware in terms of who we are and what we do, and how we coerce the fundraising sector to fit a particular model, to provide us with a particular narrative which suits our purposes, rather than doing good social change work, which is what we always say we want as foundations. Actually, the majority of that social change work fits into a model which we've coerced the sector into developing, which suits us. Having outcomes, having impact, numbers, figures, quantity, all that sort of thing. So I think for the philanthropic sector, it's really to understand whether we like it or not. What often happens is we're not looking at whether or not we're perpetuating and reinforcing those systems of inequality which we're saying that we want to address. So that would be my plea to my sector, is to really take a good hard look at whether or not we're part of the problem or part of the solution.
Vu.
A couple of things that come to mind to me. One is I would really encourage us all to move away from this sort of empathy as the basis for fundraising and move towards justice, right? Empathy is great, but it's been like we've been training one another to pull at the heartstrings of donors. And over a long time, we train them to believe that something has to pull at their heartstring in order for them to care about it. And I think that as great as empathy is, it is limited. And there's a lot of things that people will never be able to empathize with. And just because you can't empathize with something doesn't mean that you shouldn't support it. But that's kind of what we've been training donors to think about. And I think about the politicians over here who say things like, I support marriage equality now because my son or daughter came out as gay. Well, what if they never came out as gay? Is that why you were so adamantly, because you could not empathize? And I think we got to train people to believe we got to do the right thing because those are the right things to do, because they are grounded in justice, not grounded in your feelings, because in many ways your feelings are not relevant to justice. And the other thing I would say is that we got to disconnect this sort of unconscious belief that if someone has money, that somehow they have knowledge and the authority to make decisions. And this goes for foundations, but also individual donors. Where I got into an argument with a foundation, and they were like, "Vu, you keep saying all these things. Well, what should we fund? What should our priorities be?" And I said, "Why do you get any? What gives you any authority to make any decisions at all?" In many ways, foundations and people, major donors who are mostly white, they are some of the least knowledgeable people in our sector, and they have the most power to set priorities, and then we have to align with them. It makes no sense whatsoever. So we had to get out of that. And I think it's shocking for some funders. They're like, so we should just like back away and just not make it. Yes, you need to trust the communities that are most affected by systemic injustice. Right now, the Black community is still being killed by the police. In the US, Black people are being killed by the police. We have like indigenous murder, missing indigenous women. We have, I know in Canada with the indigenous children who were murdered by white administrators and church leaders and government officials. Like, if we care about these things, then we need to get resources to the communities and just let them decide what they're going to do.
I love that. And I think justice can be such a powerful motivator as well. Because again, thinking back to that same human rights organization, every time I just tried to build agency of the person that we're talking about, thinking about what they're doing to sort of change their situation. And like, I can't remember the stats, but they was always surprised that that sort of approach performed so well. Rickesh, what's your message to the sector?
I like to get very practical for folks who, like myself, want to know, well, what do I do on an individual level? And I think the first step, as my co-panelists have talked about is just the self-reflection piece is so important about how we're operating. I think as fundraising, if you're in a position where you have any kind of power or privilege, to really understand how you're upholding some of the same issues. And I think that was been definitely a learning moment of the last few years for me, is how I'm a tool for upholding white supremacy. So just because I'm a person of color, that doesn't mean that I can't be part of the problem. I think these are the kinds of dualities we have to work on. And yes, we're doing good, but yes, we can do harm. Yes, I'm a person of color, but yes, I can be upholding some of the same issues. And I think that to me is this: just really reflect on your own role in this, and stop the bleeding. Like, if we're going to talk about making big change out there, the first thing we need to do is, I really feel like it's looking in-house as a starting point anyways. It's not the end, but if you don't have that in order, then it's going to be very much hypocritical to be out there speaking out on some of these issues. So that's my invitation, is to individuals. What is it you can do to spend your social capital and use your privilege, power, whatever that looks like for you, to just to stop some of this, stop reinforcing some of the issues.
So yeah, I'm going to draw us to a close now with a question around self-care, particularly because as people of color in these spaces, so often we are the ones that are initiating these discussions. We're the ones that have quite a lot of pressure on us in terms of having conversations on race and racism and white supremacy and power within our work. And so often going against the grain and trying to fight these fights in positions where we might not have as much power can be really draining and really difficult. So I just want to hear from each of you. How do you build self-care for yourself and for your communities into your practice, into this work? Vu, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, John. Real quick, piggybacking on Rikesh's comments about actions we can take, because I think oftentimes when we as people of color bring out these issues, and the sort of people are like, why are you all so whiny? What actions are you going to take, and blah, blah, blah. Listen, okay, the community-centric fundraising movement, there's a 4-page list of actions. You go to tinyurl.com/equitable fundraising, and there's that. So follow some of that. Regarding self-care, I'm really exhausted. I think even the conversation on self-care needs to be, really robust, because otherwise it becomes one more thing on our to-do list, right? I think really for us as people of color, we just need to do whatever we need to recharge. But reality is that it's the systems that are burning us out. It's the lack of pay, it's the pay gap, it's the constant microaggression in our sector. So I don't want self-care to be something that's only on us. It should be on the rest of the sector to create an environment where we can get a break and we don't have to think as much about self-care, because it's just naturally building. We're not burning out as much.
Rickesh, I'm going to go to you next.
I completely agree. Burnout is a system failure, and it shouldn't just be up to us to have to speak on this stuff. We really do need our colleagues, our white fundraisers, fundraising leaders, to also be embracing those in positions of leadership. But as far as what we can do, because this does take so much energy, and I fully get why some folks feel not safe to do so, but when you do speak up and you get the backlash, you face the fragility, I really think it's about self-compassion, because some of this stuff can be really hard. Just reassuring yourself you're doing the best you can do, and that you're going to continue to grow and get where you need to. And I really feel, for me, the amazing words of Maya Angelou around know better, do better. It's just that it allows for you to make mistakes, but also doesn't let you off the hook, and just being forgiving that you're not going to get this right. And there's this element of perfection that we talk about, being okay to make those mistakes. And sometimes, here's my other thing, is take a break from social media sometimes. For those of us that are on it, just get off for a few days even, and just see the difference it makes, and you come back refreshed and renewed, because if you're constantly inundated, it can take its toll on you. So those are a couple of ideas for me.
And Fozia, take us home.
I think the single most important thing for me, which has made a difference, is having a circle of support. So it's not about individual actions as such, but having a circle of support, people who I can be honest, authentic with, where I don't carry the burden of representation, and who understand exactly what I'm going through, and who help me speak my truth when I need to. But the second thing would be know when to step in, but also know when to step back. There is no obligation on us to always step into the fight, to always address every microaggression, to address every failure. That's not our responsibility. So know when to step back, I think, is really important.
Absolutely, pick your battles. Look, I could keep this conversation going forever, but yeah, I think thinking about this, self-care is difficult because I guess in the sector I've always been the one to like push and fight the fight, and I think stepping away is such a powerful thing to end on, because I think that's something that I need to do better myself on sometimes, whether it's just on social media or just whatever. Like, I think taking that step back and reflecting and being more strategic as a result as well, I think is something that I'd a message I'd send out to everyone watching. Thank you so much for all of this. It's been really powerful, and I think what I want us all to take away to everyone watching is just take some time to really reflect on the power structures and dynamics at play within this world, how our actions feed into the system of white supremacy within fundraising, and think about what you can do to do better, whether you're a leader in an organization, whether you have a sort of lower level role in fundraising, wherever you are, what is within your gift to sort of move ourselves towards an anti-racist future for fundraising and philanthropy. And definitely take care of yourselves, because this is hard, and I hope we can carry on this conversation on Twitter and social media and wherever. Yeah, really keen to hear from everyone about what you think on all this. This has been absolutely amazing, and I want to thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you.